Hi everyone, it's Danny Schur, composer-producer of the Stan movie musical. Today we're gonna time travel 5 ways that it's 1919 again. So you're probably wondering, how do I know so much about 1919? Well, the Stan movie musical is set against the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike. So I've read every book, and I'm talking all the books. Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. She's an Oxford professor, Canadian board. Ooh, one that you really have to read, The Rites of Spring by Modris Eckstein. It'll just totally help you understand that era. And then locally, of course, all the stuff about the Winnipeg General Strike. But one of the coolest books in the strikers' own words. It's like being there right in 1919. And also, I was bit by the history bug in my grade 12 summer job in 1984. There I go again, dating my dinosaur self. I got to co-write the small town history of the small town I grew up in, Ethelbert, Manitoba, the ties that bind. And I wrote the history of the actual town itself. It's just a hamlet. I mean, in the 50s at its height, it probably had like 1,200 people. There was like 600 when I lived there, and there's probably 300 now. It was literally cut out of the bush. Here's a picture of it in 1899, and settled predominantly by Ukrainian immigrants. In the comments section, I'm going to have links to everything I'm talking about. You know, I wish this time travel was a good thing. On the whole, the time travel that we're experiencing right now in 2020, back to 1919, it's not a good thing. But I think we got to talk about it and educate ourselves. That's the only way we're going to work through it. So this is my little attempt at doing that. So the number one way that we're time traveling back to 1919 right now is the global pandemic. You know, when I was a kid, I used to think, oh man, back in 1918-19 when they had Spanish influenza, were they ever dumb? They didn't know anything about diseases, and that's how 50 million people across the world died. Now as a 53-year-old, do I see how dumb I was for thinking that? Because viruses are an insidious thing. We can know tons about science, and it can still envelop the whole world quickly, as we're seeing now. And in 1918, 1919, they knew the same things we did. They knew about germ theory. They knew about social distancing. They knew about shutting down the economy. Wear a mask. Stay away from people. If you're sick, don't leave the house. And certainly don't congregate in big crowds. Like today, the pandemic started in one spot, quickly traveled the world. The best guess is that the outbreak of influenza, which came to be known as Spanish influenza, started in an army barracks in Kansas and then worked its way with the soldiers over to Europe. Came to be called Spanish influenza only because Spain wasn't in the war and could actually report about it freely in the press, whereas other allied armies wanted to keep it quiet. There is just one way, like now, which is to deny that it even existed. Like today, there was major clamoring to open up the economy. There were very interesting case studies of cities that the virus did not spread in as rapidly against those cities that didn't close down and who suffered horrific losses. And kind of ominously for us today in 2020, in 1918, 19, and 20, there were waves of the pandemic. First one was the least deadly. The second one was hugely deadly, which coincided with the conclusion of the war and group gatherings in celebration of the end of the war. And then there was even a third wave well into the fall of 1920 and even into 1921. So sadly, we here in June 2020 are tiring of the fight against the virus. The virus hasn't tired. So our lesson from 1919-20 should be keep fighting the fight against the pandemic. The second time travel back to 1919, the devastation of the working class. As a result of the pandemic now, we have millions and millions of people unemployed across North America and millions more across the world. In 1919, the unemployment was due to the post-war inflation. I have a prop, so check this out. 1919 period pail, which would have been made in Winnipeg here, Vulcan Ironworks. So one-piece thing that's just bashed out of a piece of metal. So guess how much that pail cost in 1914? Great guess, 25 cents, which for some people was a whole day's work. Guess how much same pail cost in 1919? Fantastic guess. Who'd have thought 1,000% inflation, $2.50. So you ask yourself, how's that even possible? Well, the demand for materials for the war, specifically metals, meant that there was just no metals left. So the law of supply and demand dictates that if you want a pail 5 years later, with so little metal around, places like Vulcan Ironworks made much fewer pails and the cost went up. Now imagine that happening across the whole world in the spring of 1919, inflation rates of up to 80%. So that led to this worldwide economic situation that manifested in general strikes, the shutting downs of whole cities, whole regions in protest for this just calamitous economic situation. In Winnipeg, it was the 1919 Winnipeg general strike, preceded just a few months before by the Seattle general strike. But all across the world, general strikes were the way that the average worker was saying, we can't handle this anymore. Brisbane, Barcelona, just among many others. So 1919, year of the general strike, because the working class was just getting decimated like it is now as a result of the pandemic. Third time travel from 2020 to 1919, and it's hard to talk about. It's every bit as despicable now as it was then. Anti-black racism. On one hand, it's incomprehensible that we should be talking about racism. I thought when Obama was elected president that it was the dawn of a new post-racist era. I was really wrong. And I thought incorrectly that in 1919, the term the Red Summer of 1919 was a reference to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia migrating to North America. Super wrong. Turns out that the term the Red Summer was for all the blood that was let in major cities all across the United States, Washington, Chicago, a whole host of others, some 25 major white supremacist riots. The George Floyd of the day was a young man named Eugene Williams in Chicago. His only crime was to float from the segregated beach black area over into the white area. He was stoned and drowned, which set off the Chicago riots of 1919. Like today, the black community launched protests and were met with vicious violence, both from police and from civilians. And closer to my home, Canada was no better. During the Great Migration, a little known fact of American history is that some Oklahomans left Oklahoma and went as far north as they could to Manitoba and Winnipeg, and then over into Saskatchewan and in Alberta. There's a famous settlement called Amber Valley in Alberta, right in the center of a Ukrainian settlement that was exclusively a black settlement. Well, in 1919, Canada banned the mass migration of blacks once they found out that all these people were coming from Oklahoma.
You got this color skin, and they don't let you in no more.
Canada, in fact, closed the door to black immigration until the 1960s. So much for the image of Canada as this utopian paradise. And now the fourth time travel from 2020 to 1919, Indigenous land claims. So I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Manitoba was founded in 1870. It's actually our 150th anniversary right now. Happy 150th, Manitoba. And the leader who brought Manitoba into Federation, the only instance of an Indigenous leader bringing a territory into the Federation successfully in North American history, was none other than Louis Riel. Louis Riel was a French mixed-blood Métis. Riel led the process for the adoption of the Manitoba Act, which saw to it that the original Métis dwellers were granted land. Well, by 1919, that didn't happen. It took until almost 100 years later that the Supreme Court of Canada righted that wrong and saw to it that Métis status was the equivalent of Indigenous status and that land claims would be respected. And right where I'm sitting in Winnipeg, our water was provided from a lake in northwestern Ontario called Shoal Lake. The Shoal Lake Aqueduct was built in 1919. Ever since 1919, Winnipeg has enjoyed fresh water. But the racism that saw the building of the Shoal Lake Aqueduct also saw to it that the tribe in the region had its only access to the road cut off by the aqueduct. It was just last year, 100 years later, that the so-called Freedom Road was built to allow that tribe to get access to the rest of the world. Before COVID, all across the news in Canada and in the United States, Indigenous land claims still not settled in regards to pipelines traversing their territory. Just another way, not a great way, that 2020 is 1919 all over again. And the fifth time travel from 2020 to 1919, immigrant internment camps. Remember I said I'm from the little town of Ethelbert, Manitoba, Canada? Largely settled by Ukrainian immigrants. And so in the Ukrainian community, I'm really aware of the First World War internment of enemy aliens. Today it's all across the news about the internment of immigrants, sometimes without their children, behind wire fences. This is very much the case for the Ukrainian community during the First World War. Even though most Ukrainians left Ukraine like rats from a sinking ship, when the First World War started, Ukraine was on the wrong side of that conflict. And it saw all these immigrants be deemed enemy aliens, enemies of the state, rounded up and put in 25 prisoner of war camps all across Canada. So in the Ukrainian community, this was a humongous insult and stain on the relationship with Canada. As a kid growing up, I thought, God, that'll never happen again. That was First World War stuff. We see that it is indeed possible to find a way to do othering. This principle of having a group be deemed not like us. The technical term in academia is nativism, when whomever has been somewhere longer says those new people can't come in. This has just been a really pick-me-up video, hasn't it? Like I say, the reason for doing this video is we got to talk about this kind of stuff. Thanks for doing the time traveling. Hope it's been worthwhile. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe if you like this content. As a sort of antidote to this kind of dark content in this video, I offer a song. Here's the link to the video of Lisa Bell singing Stand, which is the title track from the Stand movie musical. Really inspirational. Check out the video. Thanks very much. See ya.